So welcome everybody to the next edition of our Digital Research Seminar Series. And I'm very happy and very proud today to have Hanna E here from the University of Toronto. Hanna, we have met a few times. The first time was, of course, online quite a few years ago. So the last time we met in person, I think, was in 2023 at the COSI conference in Harrisonburg, Virginia. Hanna has received a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in 2021, and she is now working at the University of Toronto. Her new book will be out in the summer. I just checked on the University of Oxford Press website there. It says August 2025 on apocalyptic authoritarianism, and that is also the topic of today's session. So yeah, I'm very happy that you are here, Hanna, that you're taking the time to talk about your research and your forthcoming book. I'm going to shut up now, and it's over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. All right. 1 second. Okay, it looks good. You can see the whole slide and not the notes or anything. All right. So I can't see anyone else. So if there is any issue with the audio or anything, just shout out on unmute and let me know, because I can only see my slides and myself right now, which is unfortunate, but that's the way the settings are for me for this view. But thank you so much for the introduction. It's a really a real pleasure and honor to be here today. And thank you, Antal, for the invitation to speak. It really it's exciting to have this opportunity to talk with you all about my book. This is the first formal kind of book talk that I'm doing on the project, so I'm really excited to get your thoughts and the Q&A after. And so yes, it's going to be released in the UK and worldwide on August 23rd, in North America on June 6th, but online on April 11th. So the ebook should be available soon on April 11th. That's what the publisher tells me, at least. So hopefully that happens. So yes, the title of my book is Apocalyptic Authoritarianism, and it's going to be published with Oxford University Press. So I have at the end of the slide some QR codes if you are interested in pre-ordering the book too. So I find it's always helpful knowing who a speaker is and where they are coming from in terms of their background and approach to research. So I wanted to start off today with a little bit about where I'm coming from and how I think about both climate change, journalism, and democratic politics, which is the topic of my new book, and also how I approach climate change communication research more generally. I have a PhD in communication, like Antal said, but I currently work in an interdisciplinary environmental studies department at the University of Toronto in Canada as an assistant professor of climate change communication. And I'm the only communication scholar in a really interdisciplinary environmental studies program, which has been really, really interesting. And I consider myself to be a humanistic social scientist, and I integrate perspectives from communication studies and environmental studies, as well as from political theory and social theory, into my work. And my work specifically concentrates on what I call the climate, media, democracy nexus, and explores questions of power, identity formation, and meaning making around climate change. I've recently written about environmental social movements, social media, climate art, and climate journalism, always with an eye to power and a focus on how and why certain ways of representing climate change have come to be, and how these modes of representation shape and influence the types of responses that are proposed or not to address the disparate threats and impacts of climate change. Or put differently, I'm interested in how the causes, risks, and proposed responses to climate change are conceptualized, communicated, and contested across different cultural, political, and social contexts, and importantly, to what end. So as a humanistic social scientist who primarily uses critical and interpretive methods of inquiry, I take context very seriously. Across my work, I seek to understand both the continuities and contingencies of certain ways of knowing, and how, borrowing the phrase from Michel Foucault, regimes of truth came to be and are challenged or maintained. So, as a critical climate communication scholar attuned to questions of truth, identity, and power, there has been a lot to pay attention to and to try to make sense of over the past handful of years. Researchers of social change often refer to particularly influential ruptures or events in historical time as critical junctures, or in the words of Claude Levi-Strauss, hot moments. The year 2016 in the US, where I am originally from and was living at the time, certainly felt sweltering, and the heat hasn't come close to letting up. Um, hasn't come close to letting up with yet another Trump electoral victory in November 2024. This heat, of course, I mean metaphorically to describe the intense turmoil brought about with Donald Trump's victory in the presidential election that year, and again last year, but also I mean it quite literally too, with the steady rise in destructive wildfires, storms, and flooding intensified by climate change. This literal heating has coincided with the metaphorical inferno of Trump's presidencies, of which David Remnick describes here in this New Yorker article on this slide, following Trump's first 2016 election, as a moment of revulsion and profound anxiety. This was a hot moment when a sense of self as a nation first incinerated in a desperate search for American identity and a so-called return to normalcy became commonplace across op-eds, commentaries, and editorials in the US press, much like what we are seeing again today. The question is, how on earth are we back here again, and with something even more monstrous than the first time around? Clearly, the reckoning that was so desperately required in the US after Trump's first electoral victory nearly a decade ago did not occur for many Americans or to the degree required. My book reveals key insights to help answer this question of how we're back here again. Stemming from my critical discourse and visual analysis of climate change journalism in the years between Trump's first and second electoral victories, my book argues that in these pivotal 8 years, stories of apocalyptic disarray dominated how both the threats of climate change and anti-democratic politics came to be known. For US journalists in the latter half of the 2010s, the immediate, as opposed to far off, impacts of climate change were becoming increasingly apparent at the very same time as the risks of anti-democratic politics and anti-journalistic fervor were too, following the election of Trump in 2016, a man who refers to the US press as the enemy of the people. So not only were American journalists trying to wrap their heads around the shocking election of a liberal president who stoked hatred and division, but they were also trying to defend their right to exist as a free and independent press, all the while grappling with how to cover a world literally burning around them. Indeed, the destructive floods in the UK, massive fires on the west coast of North America and in Australia, and deadly heat waves across Europe were occurring in tandem with the highly visible violence of white supremacy, misogyny, and xenophobia under the likes of Trump. It is quite notable and also quite understandable, considering these fraught and in many ways unprecedented contexts, that since 2016, the unfolding climate and democratic crises have in many ways been transposed upon each other and interpreted by wary journalists through a singular lens of total crisis or apocalypse. Brad Plumer, a New York Times climate journalist, even refers to his beat as the apocalypse beat. This subsuming of climate change within an all-encompassing image and narrative of total crisis is troubling, my book shows, because it ignites an intense longing among traditionally privileged groups for the return to supposedly less precarious and more stable times in the US before the total crisis began. The violent exploitation of unpaid enslaved labor, indigenous people, and land are conveniently elided in these nostalgic tales of the nation's past. This elision is deeply consequential because instead of a journalistic reckoning with the exploitative political economic structures that propel both climate change and social injustices, and that brought us the authoritarian Trump regime, these structures are left largely unquestioned and unexamined in stories of apocalyptic disarray. Notably, the US climate beat gained, just gonna push OK for a transcription. So the climate beat gained substantial traction for the first time in the US during the year 2019, which was a few years into the first Trump presidency. The ever-present specter of apocalypse within climate news stories during this tumultuous period indelibly shaped a nascent climate beat with profound present-day implications. Editorial boards across the country committed to the Covering Climate Now initiative, which was co-founded by the Columbia Journalism Review and The Nation in association with The Guardian and WNYC in 2019. Covering Climate Now was in part a response to the pronounced and sustained attack on both climate science and journalism from a Trump White House. Through this new initiative, major media outlets within the US promised to dedicate the resources, personnel, time, and attention required to produce more climate change reporting amid worsening environmental and political conditions. Reflective of this commitment, the Media and Climate Change Observatory at the University of Colorado at Boulder found that newspaper coverage of climate change was up 73% in 2019 compared to 2018. Within this milieu of increased news coverage, there was also a parallel spike in climate themes across popular culture in the US. Trending musicians such as Billie Eilish sang about the climate apocalypse, and the writers of hit American shows like Big Little Lies developed plot lines around kids' climate anxieties. Oxford Dictionaries even named the climate emergency its 2019 word of the year and had an all-climate related shortlist, including climate action, climate denial, and eco-anxiety. Moreover, the majority of Americans in 2019 expressed that they were not only convinced that climate change was real, a question that quite notoriously lasted for far too long in the US, but that they were also both alarmed by the threats of climate change and wanted to do something about it. This was a really striking moment of change. For so many years prior to 2019, climate communication and journalism scholars in the US were largely concerned with how to accurately and effectively communicate and translate the science so as to raise widespread public concern and encourage robust climate action. But now people were concerned. The attention was there. Public awareness, interest, and a motivated desire for comprehensive action were all evident in the US for the first time. Americans wanted radical change, and yet the ultimate direction that climate journalism would take stifled as opposed to bolstered this incredible momentum. The journalistic treatment of young climate justice activists during this hot moment is an illustrative example of how US news media dampened these prodigious calls for change. Notably, many of the most popular visions for how to effectively respond to the threats of climate change and the anti-democratic politics of Trump came from youth-led, and in particular, young women of color-led, climate justice groups and grassroots movements. These movements formed prior to 2019 in the US, before the media took serious note of climate change. Progressive climate activist coalitions like the Sunrise Movement began in 2017 in the wake of an alarming Trump election and built upon decades of community organizing, as did the development of the widely popular at the time Green New Deal, which proposed a more inclusive and robust climate policymaking process that included and centered Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities, as well as working class oil and gas laborers who had been historically left out of federal climate and energy conversations on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a young progressive woman of color, ran with the Green New Deal as a core commitment during the 2018 midterm congressional election, an election she would go on to win, ousting a long-standing Democratic Party figure and ushering in a more vibrant and hopeful vision for what American politics could look like amid a demoralizing Trump presidency. Eventually, Representative Ocasio-Cortez filed the resolution for a Green New Deal with the US Congress on February 7, 2019. Although the resolution ultimately did not pass, it nonetheless marked a key turning point in contemporary American politics by illustrating what an alternative identity and robustly democratic direction for the US could look like. It cannot be underscored enough that this alternative identity and alternative direction for the US that centered climate change was incredibly popular across the American population at the time. It is clear that within the tumult of the 2016 US presidential election of Trump, there was and remains a notable longing for balance, stability, and a renewed sense of self as a nation through a clear demarcation of us versus them. The all-encompassing image of a total crisis and repeated fear-mongering of extremists across climate journalism, however, works in favor of a reactionary and anti-democratic project. The image of civilizational collapse and a further loss of American prestige and power ushered in by threatening others closes off a more nuanced consideration of the many possible responses to climate change and Trump beyond a silver bullet technological or green capitalist solution. It is especially striking that Representative Ocasio-Cortez and young female supporters of color who advocate for the Green New Deal have been repeatedly singled out and represented as especially threatening to the US across both conservative and centrist media alike. The construction of a young militant other has taken off more widely and visibly across climate journalism since further fuel was added to the perceived fire of total crisis when the COVID-19 pandemic began in 2020. Within the chaos of a devastating pandemic and at the heels of a tumultuous first Trump presidency, a regime of climate journalism solidified around a binary that clearly distinguishes a moderate, older, whiter, visionary sage figure who is reported on as capable of putting the US and globe back on a stable path, versus a militant climate justice activist and woke radical leftist who is portrayed as impeding this return to normalcy that, according to journalists, the American people supposedly so desperately desire after years of profound upheaval. Legacy media publications like the New York Times and establishment Democratic politicians like Sean Patrick Maloney, who bitterly lost the 2022 midterm election and blames young progressives like Ocasio-Cortez for his loss, repeat and amplify Republican talking points and fearmonger about the so-called new left as a profound threat to the US nation state. My book reveals how it is through this othering and fear-mongering that a concerning concretization of the boundaries around who should and who should not be included in climate decision-making processes and in American politics altogether is taking place across US journalistic and political discourse. Young female climate justice activists of color are clearly being othered and delegitimized as uncivil subjects who should not be included in climate, party, or national deliberations. There's a growing consensus across the US national press, from the center to the right, that a woke or so-called new left is a destabilizing force that must be stopped. Conversely, traditionally privileged figures are centered and celebrated as visionary sages and as the ultimate authorities who should be followed and who are singularly capable of bringing back national and planetary stability and so-called normalcy. The simultaneous disparagement of young progressive women of color, a historically marginalized group in the US, and glorification of older white men, a historically advantaged group in the US, is consistent with wider patterns in American journalism and politics following the tumult of the 2016 presidential election of Trump, and is definitive of what I refer to as apocalyptic authoritarianism. Fundamentally, apocalyptic authoritarianism describes the reactionary posturing and political alignment of historically privileged figures transcendent of the partisan center and right, who are united through a common enemy of the new left and a shared appeal to apocalyptic fears of total crisis. Fear-mongering of a supposedly America-hating contingent of woke leftist radicals who are threatening the nation and impeding the earth-saving work of visionary sages is precisely where apocalyptic authoritarianism in the US hardens the line between an us and them. There's little room for imagining dynamic subjectivities and alternative futures beyond the one supposedly fated path that is discursively sedimented within a strict dualism of right and wrong. The supreme authority of visionary sage figures is justified through their claimed singular capacity to shepherd the wayward masses back onto this one and only righteous path towards national recovery, stability, and glory promised by the national myth of manifest destiny. According to this reactionary logic, it is the job of traditional authorities and pro-American saviors to bring back order by eliminating all unruly others, leading the nation astray and away from its God-ordained mission of spreading the light of liberty and supposedly superior American values and virtues across the globe. My book shows how US climate journalism is bolstering apocalyptic authoritarianism as opposed to reckoning with the roots and ramifications of both climate change and the rising currents of anti-democratic politics. To be sure, comprehensive journalistic work is incredibly challenging and is only becoming more difficult with fewer jobs, less public support, and minimal financial resources available for reporters. Clearly, journalists have been navigating extremely turbulent waters for quite some time now, with an unprecedented drop in public trust amid a long-term failure to financially adapt to the shifting tides of digital platforms and social media. Instead of changing course away from hyper-capitalistic business models and an increasingly elite-oriented and inaccessible style of news, however, advocates of traditional journalism, is the preferred term by the publisher of the New York Times, A.G. Sulzberger, to describe well-established news outlets with professionally trained reporters, national print editions, in addition to online versions, and a national audience, are buckling down on the old ways with fervor. But these old ways fall far short of what is required to contend with the techno-political, environmental, and societal shifts of a post-2016 present. Traditional journalists are failing to grapple with the complexities of climate change and are deepening as opposed to investigating the false equivalencies, myths, and politics of othering that propel apocalyptic authoritarianism at the expense of more robustly democratic alternatives. Ultimately, apocalyptic anxieties during the age of Trump have shaped and continue to shape journalistic and political interpretations of climate change in ways that severely limit how it has come to be known, imagined, and contended with, both inside and outside of the newsroom. These anxieties and the reactionary responses to them are sculpting a new regime of climate journalism and politics. As a sort of Frankenstein's monster of reanimated national myths and memories, the US climate beat is becoming an amalgamation of categories and concepts that are not only outmoded, but also dangerously myopic and exclusionary. Each chapter in my book shows how visual and textual news media representations of climate change are often characterized by four recurrent tropes that lie at the crux of apocalyptic authoritarianism, including, firstly, appeals to nationalism and discursive processes of othering, which I detail in chapter 1. Secondly, the celebration of planetary scale solutions, which I detail in chapter 2. Thirdly, the admiration of visionary sage figures, which I detail in chapter 3. And 4, necropolitical claims of the supposedly inevitable climate deaths of racialized others, which I detail in chapter 4. Each of these dominant tropes fan the flames of apocalyptic authoritarianism and hinder more deeply contextualized ways of making sense of and responding to the complexities of climate change and to the expansion of reactionary politics today. More dynamic forms of climate reporting require a fundamental reckoning with the structures of power that sustain traditionally privileged figures' authority, including the authority of traditional journalists themselves, above all others. In place of this reckoning, many journalists in the US are elevating historical centers of power and closing off deeper and more nuanced considerations of the fast and slow violences of the past and present. Notably, at the center of the US climate beat are nostalgic memories of America's yesteryears that are brought forward in news stories and commentaries to, in part, provide a clearer sense of direction amid this perceived total crisis. National myths of grandeur, exceptionalism, and dominion have been reactivated within a nascent post-2016 climate beat, a beat that, as I've already detailed, took definitive root in 2019. Significantly, there is an evident desire for a return to an imagined post-World War II golden age in particular. It is not inconsequential that this romanticized period predates the civil rights movement and radical pro-democracy politics of the late 1960s. This pre-civil rights, post-war era was a period when historically privileged figures, including traditional journalists writing for prominent national news outlets, were on more solid ground in the US. This privilege is precisely what young social and climate justice activists are again questioning today, just like their progressive forebears, and also precisely what traditional centers of power are desperately trying to cling to, protect, and fortify once more. Calls to, quote, mobilize to defeat climate change and to, quote, win the war on warming across US news headlines reflect a longing for a time when traditional authorities were imagined to have been more respected, and American centrality and global leadership were also understood to have been on much more solid ground. During and after World War II, United States official government and media narratives cast other nations as unstable and either wrought by or at risk of social upheaval and extremism, and thus in need of saving by a supposedly superior American way of life, according to the nationalistic logic of the myth of American exceptionalism and manifest destiny. With the corruption, violence, and incivility of the Trump presidency, this idea of an exceptional America was shaken to the core for many in 2016, and of course again today. Again, within the fray of a rattled sense of self, post-2016 media accounts reflected a desperate search for American identity. Crucially, this search, however, focused in on a longing for a sense of balance in order to reassert the long-believed uniqueness of United States culture and values. This helps explain why public and media discourse turned to the historical events of World War II to call to the fore collective memories of times in the past when the United States is remembered by Americans and the stories they tell to have demonstrated its so-called unique leadership during times of unparalleled hardship. Jake Sullivan demonstrates this memory work in a special issue of Atlantic magazine published in early 2019 by claiming how, quote, "For centuries, European states waged war with grim regularity. The fact that the major powers have not returned to war with one another since 1945 is a remarkable achievement of American statecraft. These allusions to a glorified American past," sorry, that's end quote there. So these allusions to a glorified American past were brought forward to stoke rallying cries for, again, in the words of former President Joe Biden's appointed National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, who I'm quoting here, he calls for a new American exceptionalism. So notably, the 2020 election and prospective Biden presidency came to be represented as a profound opportunity for the so-called new American exceptionalism to take shape in part through his leadership on climate change. Because as we saw, there was a lot of momentum and a lot of movement around Americans' desire for radical change, and a lot of it revolved around climate change and the Green New Deal before it was picked up by the U.S. press and disparaged. And Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and her supporters represented as anti-American, extremist others, and positioned as threatening to the nation, as opposed to trying to work towards a more democratic nation. So Sullivan stated that, quote, "Reclaiming America's place in the world will be an extraordinary challenge. For decades, the country neglected needed updates to the international system. Now Donald Trump is blowing that system up. The saying goes that when a natural disaster hits, build back better. The same applies to foreign policy. Not since 1945 has the US had the chance to go back to basics and decide which parts to keep, which to scrap, and above all, which to reinvent. After Trump, it can do just that." End quote. So it's really significant to note that this perceived critical opportunity to reassert the singularity and centrality of the United States via a so-called new American exceptionalism, or perhaps a renewed American exceptionalism, is also described by US journalists as very fragile and at great risk of slipping away if the so-called wrong responses to climate change are enacted. This binary of right and wrong, good and bad, gravely limited the possibility for different approaches informed by different experiences and perspectives to guide responses to both climate change and a deeply divided and increasingly anti-democratic United States. These are perspectives that may have been outside of the United States' limited purview and economic interests, such as the Green New Deal, like I mentioned before, but that could have fortified a stronger coalition of Americans looking for radical change. Again, the Green New Deal before it was picked up by the press had 89% support across the political spectrum. So this was a really strong potential for across United States coalition. So, Americans really did want change, but this limited purview that was perpetuated by both Biden White House and US press impeded a plurality of possible paths forward following Trump's first presidential election and term by casting all who questioned the return of US global hegemony and a top-down elite-run state as threatening and anti-American others. This binary is clear and in many ways was a critical point of entrenchment following the widespread media coverage of the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act in August 2022. The Inflation Reduction Act is a very technocratic, top-down, investment-based policy program that promises federal money to build green energy and green infrastructure projects within the US, and is quite protectionist in its conception and design. It has been heralded by moderate Democratic Party members and centrist media outlets as the most important climate bill to date. The New York Times and Washington Post, among other legacy presses, for example, ran headlines calling the Inflation Reduction Act historic, and thus as the ultimate endpoint and achievement following decades of climate activism that climaxed in particular with the recent mass climate movements at the latter half of the 2010s, immediately preceding the pandemic. The Inflation Reduction Act, in other words, is represented as the ultimate solution to address the climate crisis in a manner that stabilizes the nation and that can serve as a guiding light for the world, leading the way under Biden's leadership as a climate and global hero, and showing the world how to implement a moderate climate solution and build back better, just like after World War II, on the same scale and prestige they imagine this response being. So in stark contrast to the Inflation Reduction Act, the moderate and historic solution, according to the US press, the Green New Deal and young climate justice activists who were critical of the Inflation Reduction Act as not going far enough and as being too US-centric, too protectionist, and exclusionary and nationalistic in its design, were reported on as fools and misguided, and as threatening this historic victory and a clear route back to both national stability and a reclaimed position of unparalleled American global leadership. Some communication scholars refer to journalism as an interpretive community through which journalists collectively interpret current affairs through a shared set of historical references, values, and signposts that are consistently drawn upon to make sense of the present. In turn, through a shared set of criteria, a so-called appropriate way of reporting on or interpreting unfolding events is determined in a rather informal but quite rigid way. In the case of the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, there were clearly evident boundaries drawn around so-called correct media interpretations that are evidently strictly maintained. The popular climate justice newsletter and podcast Hot Take, produced by two women of color, Marianne Hegler and Amy Westervelt, was, for instance, allegedly canceled by their bosses at the now rather ironically named Crooked Media because they dared to cross this line set around an appropriate and a correct interpretation of the Inflation Reduction Act. In Hegler and Westervelt's words, quotes, "Our take on the Inflation Reduction Act seems to have been the straw that broke the camel's back. We acknowledge that it was the largest climate bill ever passed, but also that came with some serious problems. It doubled down on the idea of sacrifice zones, areas that are allowed to be polluted because people who are less valued live there for a start, and it carved out so many loopholes for the fossil fuel industry that it was hard to see how it would actually deliver on the best case scenario that boosters of the bill were promising. We didn't pan it entirely, but we were real about it." A few days later, the network heads took to their own shows to declare that anyone who was being critical of the bill was an idiot who didn't know what they were talking about and should be ignored. Shots fired. Again, this outright animosity towards climate justice perspectives is taking place across US media, even among so-called centrist or even center-left publications like New York Magazine. And journalists are going so far as to blame climate justice activists as not only prime threats to national stability, but also to climate stability. In the New York Magazine article published in the wake of the Inflation Reduction Act's passage that I have pictured on a slide here, which is commenting on climate justice activists' critiques of the act, the journalist disparages the climate justice movement writ large, and this is a commentary piece, but writing how it, quotes, the climate justice movement has, quotes, devolved into a simultaneously reactionary and radical program that does more to inhibit the green energy transition than to help facilitate it, end quote. This is a pretty striking statement, where essentially this journalist thinks that the climate justice movement is obstructing urgent climate action on par with uncivil and violent a right-wing reactionary movement. Climate justice activists want a more democratic, robustly democratic climate decision-making process, one that challenges notions that there is one silver bullet solution designed by just a few very smart men, where right-wing reactionaries want total power and control. Radicals and reactionaries are not the same, and this false equivalency is quite striking and quite ubiquitous in coverage of the Inflation Reduction Act and the critiques that it garnered from the Green New Deal contingent and climate justice activists. Moreover, the rampant media fear-mongering of climate justice activists and representations of them as militant others and a threat to the US ultimately works in favor of the right's political projects, and it is often a deliberate strategy used to actually delay and obstruct any and all climate action. The threat of civilizational collapse is repeatedly leveraged by the right and its allied fossil fuel industry peers to obstruct systemic transformations of the economy and government, including a just transition away from fossil fuel energy. Through narratives of, for example, petro-nationalism, which links fossil fuels with national identity, the fossil fuel industry and conservative advocates in the US Congress repeatedly leverage apocalyptic images of civilizational demise to invoke fear and anxiety around the supposed further loss of an American way of life if the US moves away from oil and gas and towards renewable energy too quickly. But the majority of Americans do want a transition to renewable energy, and moreover, a just transition to renewable energy. But really notably, while a majority does support this just transition, polling also shows that the same majority of people do not think that other Americans share their point of view. Pessimism, in other words, abounds. Social ties are clearly broken. Collective action is kept at bay, and more democratic modes of governance are kept out of reach when pessimism and distrust of peers and neighbors abound. And the fear-mongering of threatening young militant climate justice activists who are positioned as militant warriors across news media only sows more mistrust and severs further remaining social ties. And these social ties have already been weakened after years of neoliberal gutting of public institutions, law and order narratives, post-9/11 terrorist fear-mongering and mass surveillance, rampant trolling, hate speech, and misinformation circulating online, not to mention the years of isolation, alienation, and anxiety during the COVID-19 pandemic. Clearly, it serves an elite-captured state's best interests to keep collectivities broken, social ties shattered, fears high, and thus the formation of cross-partisan alliances and the organization of collective action at bay. Even if this means through police violence and force, at the same time as there is an evident concretization of a militant climate justice warrior stereotype across national news media, there's also been a spike in police repression of young climate justice activists on the ground. Through the passage of new critical infrastructure acts in the US and Canada, for example, Indigenous and climate protesters who blockade the construction of pipelines are specifically targeted and prosecuted as criminals and even terrorists. Moreover, young climate protesters are being charged with breaking other anti-terrorism laws, existing laws, anti-terrorism laws, in various nations beyond the US, from the Philippines to France to Germany and more. Peaceful climate activists worldwide are being imprisoned with lengthy sentences and slapped with steep fines. So this transformation of pro-democracy activists into irrational and uncivil others has happened before. Todd Gitlin, in his important 1972 book entitled "The Whole World is Watching: Mass Media and the Making and Unmaking of the New Left," discussed how both the Nixon administration, the Richard Nixon presidential administration, and mainstream media in the US carved out a binary of moderate versus militant activists to fearmonger about young Vietnam War protesters and Black Panthers in particular, who were cast as dangerous others, infiltrating politics to the detriment of both the Democratic Party and the nation itself. This sounds hopefully pretty familiar in what we're seeing today. So Gitlin noted that through this construction of the binary of militant versus moderate, quote, "the subtleties of situations and processes went under," end quote. Moreover, with McCarthyism and also the institutionalization of the House Un-American Activities Committee, which was renamed the House Committee on Internal Security in 1969, this othering had very real material consequences for individuals who were cast as militant or socialists and thus un-American. The implication here is that activists who are represented as militants and anti-American are criminalized as enemies of the state. The state suppression of the so-called militant others and the police's violence and force used against protesters is in turn legitimized. So Stuart Hall and his co-authors importantly highlighted in their groundbreaking book, Policing the Crisis, Mugging the State and Law and Order, how media fear-mongering and othering were directly leveraged by the state to legitimize police violence against those deemed other in the UK during the same time period that Gitlin was also writing about the US. So in particular, Hall describes how the UK media in the 1970s manufactured false narratives about a so-called mugging crisis in British metro areas that cast young Black men as violent criminals. This unsubstantiated and rampant media claim of a mugging crisis led to increased calls for and police force used against young Black men in urban centers. My book reveals how this criminalization and policing of others is happening again today under the apocalyptic specter of total crisis, with the so-called new left cast as the enemies of within who must be suppressed, detained, and if needed, violently removed from the nation state in order to combat this apocalyptic total crisis. Again, what is so striking and so crucial to understand is that this othering and criminalization of young progressives, and especially of young progressive women of color who are repeatedly singled out, that this is happening and is emanating from the far right and its digital manosphere, but it is also coming from the moderate center and the traditional legacy press. As you can see here on the left of the slide, with the New York Times recently calling the young climate justice activist from the Sunrise Movement, who co-led anti-Tesla protests in Manhattan earlier this month, calling them violence, and contributing thus directly to Trump's framing of these very same activists as dangerous, threatening, and terrorists, and to Elon Musk's fear-mongering of these protesters as part of a nefarious anti-American conspiracy with clear Red Scare undertones. So in returning to this question of how are we back here again, but with even more monstrous implications, I want to add an amended question of how do we let this happen? My book reveals and details that how the we here is not referring to the pro-democracy progressives and young climate justice activists who have been working tirelessly to try and build coalitions and contest the deeply hubristic roots of American exceptionalism and its emergent politics of authoritarianism. But rather, this we refers to both the MAGA rights and the so-called moderate center, including an unreflective Democratic Party and an unreflective national media. My book shows how in the age of Trump, the most prominent news publications on record in the US, most prominent news publications of record in the US are bolstering as opposed to questioning and investigating and uncovering the reactionary currents of apocalyptic authoritarianism as it manifests today. So, and to just wrap things up here, I can't see the timer, so hopefully I'm not too much over. But as the climate justice aligned journalist Amy Westervelt, who I mentioned was the co-host of the newsletter and podcast Hot Take I mentioned before. So Amy Westervelt, as she states, quote, "It's troubling to watch the global dehumanization of climate activists who are often painted as annoying mosquitoes, spoiled brats, or terrorists," end quote. So climate journalism does not need to contribute to this dehumanization or to this Red Scare fear-mongering that I've discussed. Climate journalism could and should be different. A reckoning and then a reimagination of what climate journalism and climate politics and American politics that centers climate could happen and is required for the US. So in the conclusion of my book, I detail some tangible proposals for how to begin this reimaginative work. So just as a teaser, so hopefully you'll read the book. But one thing is clear, apocalyptic authoritarians gain their legitimacy through the construction of a militant versus moderate binary used to justify the forceful suppression of the so-called woke leftists who are blamed for present-day chaos. Racialized and gendered tropes are leveraged across climate news coverage to paint an image of threatening young female climate justice activists of color as impeding the US from restabilizing and reclaiming its supposedly God-ordained position as an exceptional and glorious nation, guiding a wayward world towards a supposedly only singular one right path forward. The binary of militant versus moderates and American versus anti-American emboldens calls for the suppression of an already historically marginalized group of people as it further advances an already historically advantaged few. Fear-mongering and dualisms that legitimize these anti-democratic dynamics of power need to be broken. A reimagined climate journalism capable of contending with and combating apocalyptic authoritarianism, therefore, must center radically divergent subjectivities and engage with as opposed to fear and fearmonger about mass politics and young progressive activists. This is an entirely possible as well as incredibly needed task during this boiling hot moment of anti-democratic and climate threats. So I will end here with, it was a UK audience, so I have pre-order QRs for Waterstones and foils here. So I'll leave this open for just a moment and then I'll stop sharing screen and open up to a Q&A. And also too, here's my email in case any of you want to follow up. I'd love to continue the conversation. So thank you so much.